After a fierce raid on the Rakuzachi, Chihiro and his allies emerged victorious, seizing the legendary Shinichi blade and bringing down both Kyora and the corrupt auction house. In exchange for joining the Kaminabi, Chihiro surrenders this powerful weapon. Now, driven by the mysteries his father left behind, he races to find the chosen wielders of the Eternal Blades. But dark forces are already in motion. Can they reach the wielders before it's too late? Let's find out. A member of the Hishaku said their plan was going smoothly. As they had predicted, Kaminabi would take possession of the Shinichi. His companion replied that this was correct, as there was no other choice. They couldn't do anything else, so they were moving according to their plan. The group leader said it was time for their next move. Meanwhile, when Chihiro woke up, Shiba was surprised that they were perfectly in sync. He was referring to Hakuri, who was in the other bed. Hakuri asked where they were. Shiba greeted them good morning and asked how they were feeling. Hakuri's head hurt as he remembered what had last happened. Shiba explained that they had crashed from extreme exhaustion, and it was impressive that they were so synchronized. He even asked if they were twins. It was already 11 in the morning, the day after Rakuzachi. It was November 9th. Chihiro then asked what they were doing when he saw Hakuri and Tefuku there playing with Char. Hiyuki said he took long to wake up, but Tefuku told him not to worry because they hadn't been bored. They had been entertained by the video game there all night. Shiba claimed to have creamed them, whom they still didn't know well. Chihiro thought they didn't know that Shiba used to be Kaminabi too. Chihiro asked about the freed prisoners, and Shiba said they had gone home. Char then said there was a message from Inazuma. He wanted to say thank you. Hakuri was curious about who Inazuma was. Chihiro explained it was Mr. Inazuma. That's what the child at Rakuzachi called himself. He thanked Char for that message. Hakuri thought that name was cool. Anyway, everything's fine now, Hiyuki said. Normally, it was Kaminabi's job to maintain peace and protect the vulnerable. But the fact that evil still thrived in Japan was because Kaminabi lacked the necessary manpower and grit. But thanks to them, they had pulled off the entire operation seamlessly. Shiba responded that nevertheless, those were insane shenanigans. When he had told them to withdraw, they had refused. And even when they were at their limit, they still wouldn't stop. In truth, he said with trembling voice that he was happy they were okay. Because of this, Chihiro apologized. Chihiro suddenly looked for the Enten, and Hiyuki handed it to him. She added that she had entrusted the Shinichi to her colleagues, and it was at Kaminabi headquarters. She would take him there, so he should prepare. Meanwhile, Shiba already knew about their deal. He had given the Shinichi in exchange for letting him join Kaminabi. Hakuri was shocked when he heard this. Shiba said it made sense that his priority was to have the Shinichi resealed. However, he asked if he was sure about this. Hadn't he recognized one of the Hishaku? Chihiro remained quiet as he remembered the man he had fought. He answered yes. Shiba said he understood that he was anxious, but that was precisely why they needed to think carefully about their next moves. Over the past 3 years, the Hishaku had been making meticulous preparations that they couldn't comprehend. If their goal was for Kaminabi to obtain the Shinichi, then that means they had already planned their next move. Shiba asked if there wasn't another way to prepare without joining Kaminabi. Hiyuki interrupted him and asked what kind of garbage that was. She questioned his mention of other ways when it was already decided. Chihiro would join her in Kaminabi. She told him to get ready. Shiba fell silent, and Tefuku added that he seemed to be taking for granted that Kaminabi would seal the Shinichi. But the higher-ups would decide about that. There were alternatives to sealing it, such as using it. Shiba thought he understood that, but there was still a problem. If the idea was to seal the Shinichi, they needed to give it to Kaminabi, but there were too many concerns. Therefore, they needed to discuss this and eliminate some of these concerns. Chihiro suddenly asked what Kaminabi's motivation was for using the Shinichi. Tefuku clarified that Kaminabi had the sword masters, while the thieves had the enchanted blades. Using the Shinichi's power, they could break Kaminabi's deadlock with the Hishaku. Chihiro remembered what his father had said, that no one else should use the enchanted blade. So he said if he could show them another way to break that deadlock, then Kaminabi wouldn't need to use the Shinichi. Chihiro admitted that Shiba was right, and he might have been rushing. But he said this wasn't just a shot in the dark because now he had Hikori with him. Hikori was surprised by what he said. When Hiyuki asked about the strategy, he replied that they would steal the enchanted blades from the Hishaku. He explained that Hikori could freely transport registered items and items affiliated with them. For example, if he registered him, he could transport the Inten from another location. They just needed to be connected by spirit energy, and the Eternal Contract met that standard. In other words, if Hikori made contact with the sword bearers in Kaminabi's custody, he could transport the enchanted blades. Hikori was curious about the sword bearers mentioned. They were the people chosen by Kunishige Rokuhira to be entrusted with the enchanted blades. Chihiro asked how they could reach them. Tofuku answered that with the exception of the swordmaster, the bearers of enchanted blades were hidden in Kaminabi-controlled locations throughout Japan. If they died, then the enchanted blades in the Hishaku's possession could be used, so they were heavily guarded. Most of Kaminabi's forces were invested in protecting them. Only the top brass could authorize access to them. They were located in fortresses known as Sanso, Senkitsuki Temple, Kakugoku Hot Spring, Kuntaisha Shrine, and Sushi Subaru. Hikori thought that was cool, but Hiyuki said it just sounded cool. To ensure the absolute security of the sword bearers, most of them were stationed there. That was the reason why they were short-handed. Most of their forces were tied up. But Hikori responded that if they could get the enchanted blades, then Kaminabi would be freed up. And the people they freed yesterday would live in a safer world. Hiyuki agreed that the world would indeed be safer when that happened. And so Hikori was fired up to see the sword bearers. Chihiro told him he would need his help again, and he agreed. During the journey, Hiyuki said that stealing the enchanted blades from the Hishaku was a good proposal. Nothing could beat that. But she said it wouldn't be easy. First, they would be judged based on their character and trustworthiness. They couldn't prove themselves, other than being a guy wielding an enchanted blade and his pal. As far as the higher-ups were concerned, they couldn't tell what they might do if they allowed them to meet the sword bearers. There was no guarantee they would let them on board. In fact, they might even be punished. The Kaminabi leaders were shown, and Hiyuki told them to prove themselves to them. Chihiro faced them with his hands in handcuffs. One of them asked him to state his name, and he introduced himself as Chihiro Rokuhira. The Kaminabi leader told Chihiro to step forward, which he did, while Hikori, Hiyuki, and Tofuku sat down. In a flashback, Mr. Shiba said that regarding Rokuhira and the enchanted blades, there were many options, but for now, they're all in agreement about recovering the enchanted blades. He added that there was a hot debate about Chihiro and the Inten, but when needed, Azumi would side with Chihiro. Besides that, he said that if he showed up, he was 100% sure it would affect the proceedings, so he would lie low. And he explained that he had beaten up some of them because of Rokuhira. One of the Kaminabi leader with eyebrow piercings said that he couldn't see the resemblance, saying Chihiro was more handsome than his father, but for the leader with the eye patch, the father and son looked alike. The leader with white hair and strange beard said they still didn't know if Chihiro was really Rokuhira's son. Then, the first leader who spoke with Chihiro said they should begin, and they would determine how to deal with Chihiro and the enchanted blade Inten. He asked if Chihiro had said he wanted to meet the sword bearers to defeat the Hishaku. Then, we moved to the Kakugoku Hot Springs, one of the places where one of the sword bearers was located. A Kaminabi leader said they were sheltering the bearers who have eternal contracts with the enchanted blades at fortresses called Sanso. High-ranking Kaminabi sorcerers were stationed at those locations. He added that even with an enchanted blade, it would be difficult for anyone to get past those sorcerers. The female leader said security was extremely tight for one reason: to prevent outsiders from seeing the bearers. According to the leader with a long neck, they couldn't just let anyone to get close to them. And the white-haired leader asked if they had blood-tested Chihiro if he's Rokuhira's son. Someone answered that it was being analyzed, and they would get the results tomorrow. Because of this, the leader with 2 circles above his left eyebrow asked if they shouldn't just meet tomorrow, since today's meeting seemed pointless, but someone said they couldn't do that because Shinichi's seal was only temporary at present. The leader with glasses said they couldn't prolong storing the Shinichi like that, and if they were going to seal it properly, they needed to act quickly. He added that for that reason, they needed to know if Chihiro's plan to break the deadlock and thwart the Hishaku was viable. Then, he asked if Hakuri was the key to Chihiro's plan, because of his plan to contact the bearers and teleport the enchanted blades. They also asked if Hakuri had special powers, so they told him to show them, but Hiyuki said Hakuri couldn't do it right now. In a flashback, Tefuku ordered Hakuri to try sending a notebook to the storehouse, but when Hakuri did this, blood gushed from his nose. Because of this, everyone became worried as Hakuri suddenly fainted, and in the present, Tefuku said that Hakuri had only realized that power yesterday and went all out, so he needed time to rest. Hiyuki said that she had witnessed these powers herself, and it was an extremely useful skill, but where he stands is the big pain in the butt because he's not the one calling the shots. She said Chihiro was the one doing that. So the leader with glasses said that if that was the case, they needed to decide whether to give Chihiro access to the bearers. In other words, they needed to decide whether they could trust Chihiro or not. The white-haired leader asked what happened to the Cloud Gouger, and Chihiro answered that it was destroyed, which seemed to shock the leader. Then, he said they were off to a terrible start, yet Chihiro still wanted them to trust him. He added that even if they said Chihiro was Rokuhira's son, he should have known some of the leaders, because most of them were instrumental in establishing Kunishige Rokuhira's hideout in the mountains, since Chihiro probably lived there with his father. Chihiro said that he did live there, and his father himself brought him there, but he hadn't met the people the leader was referring to. The leader replied that if that was the case, all they could base things on was Chihiro's word, saying they were done discussing his identity because all the leaders had was his word. He said they should forget who he was and judge him based on what he had done, like stopping Sojo, destroying the Rakuzachi, and reclaiming the Shinuchi. Then, he asked the leaders if those were bad things, saying he had saved Kaminabi from spending money they were planning to spend. The leader with 2 circles above his left eyebrow agreed that this was true, and according to Hiyuki, if the leaders were afraid Chihiro might hurt the bearers, they should let her say something, and she said she was absolutely certain Chihiro wouldn't do that, because he only kills evildoers. The leader with the mask said that was quite a statement from Hiyuki, and according to the one next to him, he asked why Hiyuki never said such things about him, which made her call him a creepy old man. After that, Tefuku and Hakuri fist bumped, and the white-haired leader asked if they were going to judge Chihiro based on his actions. Chihiro looked like an unruly punk, so he asked what he would do after getting the enchanted blades, and if he would surrender it to them. Chihiro paused to think, and one leader said they didn't need the blood test anymore, because Chihiro was definitely Rokuhira's son, being arrogant and pig-headed, and he told his plan on how to break the deadlock. He said that they'll kill Chihiro, then entrust the Inten to a Kaminabi member, and it was obvious that this would be best for Kamunabi. At that moment, a man arrived and said that just a while ago the Kakugoku fortress had just been invaded. One leader told the man to say everything was okay, but the man said that according to eyewitness reports, after confirming several assassins and multiple energy reactions characteristic of enchanted blades, the fortress had been annihilated, and it was shown completely destroyed. The leaders were shocked, and the man added that there was also a sighting of a man with an emblem resembling flames on the back of his hand, which made one leader realize that Hishaku was behind this. The long-necked leader asked if the enchanted blade bearer, Yuruha, had died, and while the leader was asking this, Chihiro realized that this was Hishaku's next move, directly killing the bearers. The man answered the leader that they were still investigating whether Yuruha was killed, and the leader with glasses is still in disbelief at what he had heard. Chihiro thought this was possible. As he remembered his battle at Rakuzachi, Chihiro recalled the Daten-Seki and realized that the Hishaku must have a lot of them, which made him wonder why they had entrusted the only usable enchanted blade, Cloud Gouger, to Sojo. Then, he said that Hishaku was ready, and soon, they would attack the other sword bearers. He added that the leaders were right that when he got the enchanted blades, he had no intention of giving them to Kamunabi or anyone else. He added that once he got them, they would become enemies again. He also answered the question about giving the Inten to someone else. He pointed out that if it was given to a Kamunabi member, the risk would be reduced and it would be a wise choice. But there was no time because no one could master the Inten overnight, and they needed immediate fighting power. He said that he was their best bet, and the way he said it was exactly like his father, so some leaders tried to stop him, while another thought he was cool and definitely Rokuhira's son. Then, the long-bearded leader ordered to remove the cuffs, though the white-haired leader seemed to disagree. The long-bearded leader said Chihiro was right, because they had no moment to lose and no time to appoint a new bearer. He added that Chihiro had come to negotiate with them, and Hishaku was attacking them, with the latter being the immediate threat. He told Chihiro that for now, they would use him, but they had no intention of letting him do whatever he wanted with the enchanted blades. Chihiro nodded in agreement, which calmed Azumi, and the long-bearded leader said there was a new report, as the bearer was alive. The bearer had escaped from the fortress and was currently in flight, so they would give guidance to Chihiro and Hakuri, telling them to make contact with the bearer immediately and protect their life. In the next scene, Yoji Uruha was introduced to us, the contracted owner of the enchanted blade Kamiyuri. He recounted that 18 years ago, the day Mr. Rokuhira entrusted him with Kamiyuri was the high point of his life, and he fought hard in the Seitei War. He added that Mr. Rokuhira was incredibly cool, and only a few people had an ironclad composure like him. He was also impressed by Rokuhira's unreal eyes, and he said that although he knew he had said this many times, but fighting for Rokuhira was the greatest honor of his life. Uruha added that after the war ended, he voluntarily returned the enchanted blade to Rokuhira as requested. After that, Rokuhira disappeared, and he hadn't heard of him for 15 years. In the next scene, Uruha was shown looking shocked because someone told him that Rokuhira was killed by the Hishaku and they had stolen all the enchanted blades. The messenger added that the Hishaku had also killed Misaka, the bearer of Cloud Gouger, and they would come after each warrior contracted to the enchanted blades, so they can use the swords they had stolen. Uruha wondered who the Hishaku were, and his companion told him they were enemies of the state. The man added that if Hishaku used the enchanted blades, they would destroy the entire nation, the nation Uruha had fought so hard to protect. Uruha had no response to this, and the man said he wouldn't let that happen, and at that time, he would be the one to protect Uruha. Then, Uruha explained that the Kakugoku Fortress was a natural hot spring in northern Toyama Prefecture, and he lived there secluded from the outside world, protected by 14 elite Kaminabi fighters. Each day, he bathed in the same pools with the same people, but he said it wasn't so bad. His companion mentioned there was a message from headquarters, so Uruha asked if it was about the 7th enchanted blade and Rokuhira's son, but the man replied that headquarters wasn't yet certain if he was really Rokuhira's son. Uruha said he might just be an imposter, and how dare he claim Rokuhira's name. So his companion asked how he was so sure this wasn't Rokuhira's son. Uruha answered that he was certain because Rokuhira could never take care of a child. According to Uruha, he was ready to die at any time, and for 3 years after learning of Rokuhira's death, he had lost his will to live. After that, it was shown that the Kakugoku Fortress was invaded, so someone led Uruha to escape while others were scrambling to report to headquarters about the Hishaku emblem and the spirit energy reactions of the enchanted blades. His companion said that Hishaku had weird weapons, and truthfully, they couldn't defeat them, but they could buy time for Uruha to escape, because he couldn't be allowed to die. We then moved to a location 8 kilometers away from Kakugoku Hot Spring, where Uruha had arrived because his companion had directed him there, saying to head to the Atego station and they would contact headquarters and send bodyguards immediately. Uruha seemed deep in thought, wondering about these new bodyguards, because who could Kaminabi send when even these elite sorcerers weren't tough enough, and added that it would take warriors of Azumi's or Hiyuki's level. He also thought that the station's nearby and there were no signs of enemies, which made him question where his protectors were, saying this was bad. Then, as he was walking around, someone called out to him. It was Hakuri, who shyly asked if he was Mr. Uruha. Uruha told Hakuri to show his insignia, which Hakuri did. Because of this, Uruha asked Hakuri if he was his protection, and how was he able to recognize him, to which Hakuri replied that Uruha was rather conspicuous. Hakuri said he had one more companion, but they had split up to look for Uruha, who was looking around while saying the situation seemed dire. Hakuri was confused by what Uruha meant, who was saying something about people already being there. Hakuri quickly understood this, saying there were 3 of them, but according to Uruha, there were 4 sorcerers present, asking if Hakuri could kill them. Hikori asked what sword Uruha had, and he answered it was just an ordinary self-defense sword. Hikori seemed to think at that moment, remembering that Chihiro had called him special, adding that normally, a person has one kind of spirit energy inside them, limited in capacity. So when they seal an eternal contract with an enchanted blade, the price they pay is losing their original sorcery. Chihiro also said that people with eternal contracts to enchanted blades were basically defenseless. In other words, no enchanted blades meant no sorcery, which was why they needed bodyguards. Back to the present, Hikori suddenly became alert, so he told Uruha to get behind him, saying he would protect him. However, Hikori suddenly collapsed when he attempted to use his ability, making Uruha wonder what was wrong. At that moment, the sorcerers rushed at him, which surprised him. Then, he remembered what his companion had said earlier about giving their lives so he could escape, telling him to live or they would curse him. In the present, Uruha dodged a punch from one man and responded with Roger that to the man who told him to escape. While doing this, he cut off the arm of someone who tried to punch him, then threw his hat as a distraction at the next man. He sliced his hat in half, and the head of the man behind it followed. Before long, Uruha had defeated all 4 sorcerers, saying he was a bit rusty, while Hikori was thoroughly impressed by his killing of 4 sorcerers using just an ordinary sword. Uruha thought that the men weren't using the weapons they had at the fortress, making him realize there might be only a few of those, or perhaps there were other restrictions, and he hoped that was the case. At that moment, more men arrived looking for Uruha, who was getting annoyed at how many people worked for Hishaku, saying they should finish this. On the other hand, Hikori noticed the train doors were about to close, so he told Uruha to get on, which they did. However, they still saw enemies inside, and Uruha said they seemed to be surrounded, but Hikori replied that it's actually the other way around, because Chihiro was behind them. One of the enemies seemed to notice this, but Chihiro suddenly disappeared, so the man searched for where he went. In the next scene, the men were bloody and dead because of Chihiro, who said he was delighted to meet Uruha because his father mentioned him often. Uruha seemed surprised that Chihiro had an enchanted blade, since he had called him an imposter earlier, and Chihiro said that he and Hikori would take over as his protectors, promising that he wouldn't let him die. Uruha suddenly saw Kunishige in his son's face, making him mistake Chihiro for Kunishige, so he told him he could fight again for his sake. Chihiro was confused by what he said, and Hikori remarked that he might be going crazy. Chihiro said he had all the passengers move to different car, and when the train stops at the next station, they would have them get off. So after that, only they and the conductor would remain on the train. He added that they were heading to Senkitsuji Temple, and Uruha would arrive there safely, to which Uruha replied that he understood, calling Chihiro Mr. Rokuhira. Chihiro requested that Uruha not use Mr. when addressing him. Then, Chihiro thought about how the man he was talking to was the one who wielded the Kumayuri enchanted blade 18 years ago, Yoji Uruha, who seemed unable to believe what he was seeing. Chihiro asked what was wrong, and Uruha asked if he could hold his enchanted blade, making Chihiro ask if like a baby before saying it was okay. However, he asked Uruha if he shouldn't first verify his identity, that is, if he was really Rokuhira's son, but Uruha said that was crazy talk. Uruha added that Chihiro wasn't Rokuhira's son because he was Mr. Rokuhira himself, and Hikori whispered to Chihiro that Uruha's stare was weird, saying that Chihiro gave off the same exact vibes as Rokuhira, so there was no doubt he was his son. He also said it had been 18 years since he'd seen Rokuhira, so it was like seeing him again after all this time. And the 7th enchanted blade was physical proof, saying it was the real thing because it all fits. Hikori said Uruha treated the enchanted blade like a baby. Then he further explained that after the war, some of the Kaminabi started to turn against the enchanted blades and Mr. Rokuhira. So it made sense that he went into hiding. He said it was fortunate that he wasn't alone for 15 years, and Chihiro replied that his and his father's life had been good, which made Uruha say he was glad to hear that. At that moment, Chihiro remembered the Hishaku's ruthless killing of his father and their theft of the enchanted blades, so he mentioned this to his companions, saying that since then, the Hishaku had been operating secretly, manipulating Sojo and the Sazanami family, and plotting to kill the sword contracted owners, including Uruha, just to use the swords. That weapon was part of the enemy's plot. And Chihiro said that what Uruha saw at Kakugoku must have been the weapons made by Sojo, explaining they were made from Daten-Seki, the source material of the enchanted blades. He explained that it allowed the wielder to temporarily wield powers on par with enchanted blades in exchange for the user's life. Uruha remarked that Chihiro knew a lot about this, and Chihiro replied that he had seen it himself, but didn't know there were so many. He added that in any case, the Hishaku's plan was to attack simultaneously using the Daten-Seki stones and take down all the Sanso fortresses. Uruha noted that meanwhile, the Hishaku was still operating behind the scenes. Chihiro said he'd heard that a Hishaku member had appeared at Kakugoku, but according to Uruha that it was only briefly, and it was clear he was leading the sorcerers. Chihiro said their enemies seemed averse to taking on personal risks, and they could assume the stone supply wasn't infinite, but they probably had enough, and they had hired people who could wield the stones to attack the 4 fortresses. Hakori said that the weapons they had were of that caliber, and Chihiro confirmed these were the Inten and the Flamebone. Hakori compared the difference between their weapon count and the enemies, asking if they were totally outgunned. He also wondered if they could really hold off the enemy, but Uruha said his calculations were nonsense. This was because he was still alive, so Hishaku's attack on a Sanso fortress was a failure, and besides that, there were protectors at Kakugoku who would give their lives to protect him. Then, we returned to the past, after the man told Uruha to escape. He asked the clerk about their status, and they replied that the facility was destroyed and 4 guards were severely injured. So the man asked about the others, and according to the clerk, they were okay. Then, he requested a tag from the clerk, tag 108, and went to a wall full of cabinets with writing on the doors. In the present, Uruha said the guards at the fortresses were elite fighters, and it was shown that they were fighting hard against the forces sent by Hishaku. A guard noticed the signal, realizing that Uruha had escaped, and according to the two, their only job now was to lure the enemy and kill them. Uruha said that if Hishaku had only recruited random sorcerers as assassins, they wouldn't stand a chance, because the weapons would only give a momentary edge, but his guards wouldn't lose. He added that the Kaminabi guards have more than just speed and strength, as they were experienced and used to working with each other. Chihiro asked if Uruha thought they would win, and Uruha replied that he had spent 3 years with them, so he trusted them. In the next scene, it was shown that the Kaminabi guards had managed to bind an enemy sorcerer, and someone used a smoke axe skill on that enemy, causing blood to flow from their side. The man who used the smoke axe said, "So much for giving our lives," and then used the smoke axe on several more Hishaku members. Then, he told his companions that Uruha was now with his new escorts, and they were heading to Senkitsuji Temple. So someone suggested they get ahead of Uruha there and surprise him. The man who was talking to Uruha earlier said they should give Uruha a warm welcome, and in the next scene, the train carrying Chihiro's group arrived at the station. Hakori said there was no one there, and according to Chihiro, this was where they would get off. At that moment, Hakori and Uruha seemed to notice something, and in the next scene, 2 men were shown buying from a vending machine. The man with long hair said the machine had a good selection, saying he wished they had one like that in his neighborhood. He added that hiring random sorcerers wasn't enough, but was still quite satisfied since they at least eliminated a few of them using the Daten-Seki. His companion remarked that he seemed happy, and the long-haired man replied that he's happy because Yura had finally gave them permission to move. He added that for the past 3 years, since they got the enchanted blades, it had been nothing but preparation, and it was boring. He said that was just the prelude, and now the main act would begin, so he was excited. We learned that the long-haired man's name was Hirohiko, and his subordinate asked him if he really do realize that Uruha's bodyguards has an enchanted blade, to which Hirohiko replied that he knew, but they didn't need to engage with the Inten to kill Uruha. And here we see that the enemy had actually intercepted and disposed of the bodyguards who were planning to meet up with Uruha, and he would charge at them himself. However, Uruha didn't move, and it was Chihiro who met Hirohiko as he entered the train. Hakori can't help but be impressed with Uruha and thought to himself that if it were him, he would have freaked out from what happened and run right into the enemy's trap. But Uruha just kept his cool since he clearly knew how important his life was. Hirohiko also praised Uruha's self-control, while he got ready for his upcoming fight with Chihiro. Chihiro realized that the person facing him was a Hishaku member because of the tattoo on his hand, yet noticed that he wasn't present in the scene when they killed his father. Chihiro also thought that the rest of them were just hired hands. Then, he asked Hirohiko what he was trying to do, and Hirohiko was direct with him, saying he would kill Uruha and negate his eternal contract, but he realized Chihiro was referring to something else. He said that he figured perhaps Uruha wanted to properly say goodbye to his guards, and added that they were quite tough, as they had defeated the Datanseki armed troops, and that was something to be proud of. Because of this, Chihiro called Hirohiko a total beast in his mind, because he had killed those who defeated the Datanseki troops, making him think again about how Hishaku killed his father. On the other hand, Uruha was staring blankly, still seemingly unable to believe that his guards were dead. At that moment, Hakuri was calling him, and simultaneously, someone charged at them from the window. However, the man failed because Uruha killed him in an instant and even cut off one of his arms, seemingly without even drawing his katana due to his speed. Chihiro looked back at this and saw that the man who charged through the window was dead, but Uruha gave him a stern look and told him to focus since they still have a job to do. Hirohiko laughed, agreeing with what Uruha said, which made Chihiro think about what his job was, and that was to protect Mr. Uruha, so he used Nishiki, which increased his speed and agility and strengthened his attacks. Uruha thought about Nishiki and realized that it was the ability that Chihiro had used earlier. The enemy didn't even have time to respond due to its ultra-high speed. In the battle, Chihiro suddenly disappeared due to Nishiki's cloaking ability, while Hirohiko used the Blood Crane skill, where he released many pieces of small paper that automatically shaped themselves into paper cranes. Back to Chihiro, who was about to attack the two enemies in front of him, and in the next scene, he cut off one's hand, while taking the head of the one beside him. Then, Hirohiko's cranes entered the scene, and they seemed to do something that caused blood to scatter, stunning Chihiro. We learned that what the cranes did was go straight through the body of the man in front of Chihiro, and his blood sprayed out, causing it to splatter across his eyes. Hirohiko followed this with an attack using his katana, but because of Nishiki, Chihiro reacted quickly and blocked it. Chihiro seemed more angry because of Hirohiko's deceptive move, who appeared to be taunting Chihiro even though his katana was broken. On the other hand, Uruha was also fighting someone, but he was suddenly hit by shurikens that seemed to be made of paper, and Hirohiko taunted him to focus. Chihiro called out to Hakuri and shouted the word centipede to him. Hakuri seemed puzzled about what Chihiro meant, but he quickly realized what he wanted to say, that he would use the centipede skill like Kyura. Because of this, he pulled Uruha's hair to make him lie down, and Chihiro used Kuro, which released two large goldfish, signifying the large slash his skill would release. That's exactly what happened, causing their enemies to be thrown back. But Hakuri and Uruha weren't affected because they had dodged. The force of Chihiro's skill was so strong that it shattered the train's windows, and some of their enemies were thrown outside. Then, he called out to Uruha as if checking if he was okay, and Uruha replied that he was good. Hirohiko said that was a nice move, making Chihiro turn to him, while Uruha thought that the others weren't a big deal, except for the long-haired kid, Hirohiko. Uruha also realized that Hirohiko had the skill and speed to kill him while defending against an enchanted blade, making it difficult for Chihiro to protect him and fight Hirohiko. He remembered someone telling him that Hishaku killed Rokuhira, so he told Chihiro not to worry about him anymore. At that moment, memories of people close to him who were killed by the Hishaku came back to him, and he told Chihiro that he could handle Hirohiko. On the other hand, Chihiro noticed Hirohiko running toward him, so he jumped out of the train, taking Hirohiko with him, who asked if he was going to leave Uruha alone and if he was sure about that. Chihiro thought this wasn't ideal, but the risk of Hirohiko being close to Uruha was worse, and he told him to be quiet. He remembered their discussion about the balance of power earlier, and it was just as Uruha had said, that the sorcerers using Datanseki were disposable to the Hishaku, because even though they had extra power, elite fighters could still defeat them. In other words, they weren't the issue, and he explained that the issue was that they were able to weaken the Kaminabi guards enough, to the point where their elite fighters could finish them off. Chihiro explained that Kamunabi had 2 fighters with enchanted blade-level fighting prowess, while Hishaku had more, but they were short-lived, and on both sides, there were skilled fighters without enchanted blades, making him realize that the fighting power between the Hishaku and the Kamunabi was an even split. He added that their key strategy was that Hakuri's storehouse power would recover soon, because if he could contact the sword bearers, he could transport the enchanted blades. According to Chihiro, Hakuri and Uruha were heading to Senkitsuji Fortress to meet another enchanted blade owner. If Hakuri is in contact with 2 enchanted blade owners and his power recovered, then very soon, those 2 enchanted blades will break the deadlock. Back to the present, Hirohiko said that now that Chihiro had no one to protect, he could go all out, and he loves that. He added that Yuro was interested in Chihiro, and he hoped he could play with Chihiro, who had no response. Hirohiko also said too bad, because they weren't alone there. In the next scene, an origami butterfly brought a Datanseki stone to a man lying on the ground, and Hirohiko said they were playing for keeps too. When the Datanseki stone fell, Chihiro thought that the man approached by the origami butterfly was one of the fighters he had thrown out of the train, and they were nearly dead, but before he could finish his thought, Hirohiko mentioned that they were called the Counter-Enten Special Force, and it was shown that the men Chihiro had thrown out of the train were revived by the force of the stones. Chihiro thought this was exactly the deadlock they had envisioned, and according to Hirohiko, the Counter-Enten Special Force meant they could kill Chihiro. He thought about the deadlock, Uruha's encouragement, his father's death, others killed by the Hishaku, and the Hishaku itself, and said that the deadlock is about to be broken. Flashing back to Chihiro's conversation on the train, he mentioned that 18 years ago, during the height of the Seitei War, their country was protected by enchanted blades. However, he noted that Japan has now fallen into a state of chaos. He told Hakuri that if evildoers manage to kill the eternal contractors of the swords and use them, they're doomed. He recalled how his father told him how frequently Shiba says to him that he's a hero. However, he wanted Chihiro to remember that the true heroes were those who risked their lives to support his ideals and wielded the swords on the battlefield. Chihiro was just a child then, and he had complained that his father had already said this more than 100 times too. Nevertheless, his father said he would repeat it and see if it would reach 1,000 times. That's why, back on the train, Chihiro couldn't accept that they too, the sword bearers, would die. Back to the present, Chihiro and his companions had jumped off the train, and Uruha thought that now that they were far enough, Chihiro could go all out. Nevertheless, they still needed to remain on guard. Hakuri said he would protect him when enemies arrived. While Uruha appreciated this, he said they should focus first on getting to a safe place. They needed to hurry to Senkitsuji Temple. Hakuri agreed, saying someone was waiting at the next station to take them to Senkitsuji. Meanwhile, someone could be seen drawing with a marker. A man commented that he couldn't believe they had infiltrated Kakugoku, remarking how freaky it was. His companion replied that worrying wouldn't help them. They needed to ensure Uruha and the others stayed alive. Just then, they sensed that their expected contacts had arrived, and we could see what appeared to be a magic circle drawn on the ground with marker. These were Uruha's escorts, who he recognized as being from Masumi. The sorcerer greeted him, saying long time no see, and expressed joy at their survival. But he thanked the 2 youngsters for it. Uruha then noticed the magic circle on the ground and asked if they would fly directly there. The man said yes, and that Mr. Samura was also waiting. Uruha reflected that it had been quite a while since they last met. Meanwhile, this piqued Hakuri's curiosity. They suddenly vanished from the train station, and thanks to the mandala on the ground, they were instantly transported to Mount Furuma in Nara Prefecture. Uruha was surprised to find themselves on a cliff where the Senkitsuji Temple was located. Inside the temple, a monk was chanting, and behind him stood a man with a walking stick. He had a cigarette in his mouth, a large scar on his face, and was wearing shades. Meanwhile, the 4 of them went straight inside, and the sorcerer mentioned that they had heard about the plan to transport the enchanted blades. While they were talking, the man with the walking stick hurriedly ran towards them, surprising Hakuri. He greeted Hakuri with long time no see, but they both seemed puzzled. He sniffed Hakuri and touched his face. He and Uruha exchanged greetings, noting it had been a long time since they last met. This man was the previously mentioned Mr. Samura. He asked who he was holding since the person smelled like Chihiro but wasn't Chihiro. The female sorcerer replied that he would be the one teleporting the enchanted blades. Uruha was surprised that Samura knew Chihiro, to which he answered that for 10 years after the war, he knew nothing. They might have kept Rokuhira's whereabouts as a super top secret. He said it happened accidentally. Meanwhile, Hakuri suddenly introduced himself as Chihiro's friend, saying he had heard about Samura from Chihiro. Chihiro had mentioned meeting one of the sword-bearers, Samura. Shiba would occasionally take him out into the world, though his identity as Rokuhira's son was kept hidden. His father had allowed him to enjoy himself every now and then, so they would go out to explore, eat grilled squid, and buy various foods. However, Samura noticed them. He held Shiba's face and said they hadn't seen each other for a long time, over 10 years. When asked what he was doing there, Samura replied that he was just passing by when he caught a familiar scent, so he searched for it. He had smelled both Shiba and Rokuhira. Young Chihiro became curious, remembering his father's stories about Samura. Though blind, his other senses were incredibly sharp. Through his sniffing, he discovered that Rokuhira was still alive and well, and that Shiba was involved in his disappearance after the war. He noticed the child and asked if he was Rokuhira's son. Shiba hesitated to answer, but after Samura sniffed again, he said there was no need to hide it. The child reeked of Rokuhira. He hadn't imagined Rokuhira would have a child, but he couldn't be mistaken about that scent. Shiba apologized, saying this might seem creepy to the child. Shiba had no choice since Samura had figured it out. Samura responded that at least Rokuhira hadn't been alone the whole time. Chihiro then spoke up, saying he had heard a lot about him. His father had said those who wielded the swords were the true heroes. Samura was surprised to hear about being a hero and asked Chihiro to tell his father that he was the hero. He said all he did was wield the sword. Chihiro thought to himself how they all kept calling each other heroes. When Samura asked for his name, he introduced himself as Chihiro. Samura was delighted to hear this, though Shiba called him creepy. He apologized but said that was all they could tell him. Samura understood. He admitted that some of the Kaminabi guys were a real pain. He understood everything, including why they kept it secret. Nevertheless, he couldn't help but touch Chihiro's face, surprising them. He requested to at least see his face. Back at the temple, when Hakuri mentioned that Chihiro had told him about Samura's peculiar behavior, Samura remarked that he must have made a strong impression. He expressed his desire to see Chihiro again. When asked about Chihiro's whereabouts and what he was doing, since he'd heard Chihiro was coming there, Hakuri was about to answer, but Samura silenced him when the monk struck the drum. This was an indication that enemies were nearby. Outside the temple, several Hishaku contractors were positioned in the treetops. They were carrying weapons from Datanseki. As the monk warned about the enemy, Samura said there was no more time for conversation. Because the enemy had arrived, they split up. The female sorcerer took Hakuri to the treatment room. Meanwhile, Samura called Uruha and told him that he had been through a lot, so he should rest first. In the treatment room, the female sorcerer said she had heard it would take several days before his power would return. She explained that this treatment was to minimize the required time. Hakuri sat on the bed but said it wasn't a physical injury and his head just felt weird. She said she understood since she was also a sorcerer. With no time to waste, she had him lie down. Back to Chihiro's enemy Hirohiko, he stated that he possessed the enchanted blade. He asked if Chihiro was sure about his decision to leave them on their own. He knew Uruha and his friends were heading to Senkitsuji, so there will be 2 blade contractors without any protection from an enchanted blade user. He commented that they made perfect targets, and surely more would die. A powerful explosion occurred at Senkitsuji Temple, and Hakuri thought they couldn't let the contractors die. He remembered the Kaminabi sorcerers who died recently. However, Uruha assured Hakuri that it was fine and told him to focus on his treatment. Hakuri protested, but Uruha clarified that security in this place was stronger than in Kakugoku. But it wasn't because of better guards. He said if he had been stronger himself, they wouldn't have lost anyone at Kakugoku. He was referring to Samura, and that was the reason why Chihiro split off from them. If Samura was at Senkitsuji, then they couldn't lose. Moreover, He would do everything necessary to prepare a counterattack. Hakuri recalled Uruha's fighting earlier, how his skills were amazing even with just a regular sword. Coming from him, such a statement made Hakuri curious about what kind of person Mr. Sumura must be. Uruha called out to Sumura, saying Chihiro would arrive soon with information about the Hishaku. He was pleased to hear this, saying he was looking forward to seeing him again. That's why he didn't want to greet him empty-handed. The female sorcerer then spoke up, saying 30 minutes. She would recover that man's power, referring to Hakuri who was lying in the treatment room. Therefore, they needed to hold off the enemies for 30 minutes. Sumura replied that it wouldn't be a problem. Flashing back to when Shiba visited Sumura's house with Chihiro and apologized to him. However, Sumura responded that he was the one who invited them. He said it was nice to meet Rokuhira's son, and he had hoped to do more than just say hello. When he asked Shiba, he learned that Chihiro was 14 years old. Sumura expressed his desire to see his face. Shiba then asked him to remind him why he had become blind in the first place. Sumura answered that it was because of his beliefs. He explained that worldly passions like anger and desire lead people to hell. These dull both judgment and blade, and to rid himself of these, he had blinded himself. Shiba suddenly asked if smoking wasn't a worldly passion. Sumura clarified that he never lit his cigarettes, they were just a diversion. But Shiba insisted that he obviously wanted to smoke them, which definitely counted as a worldly passion. Sumura replied that since he didn't light them, it didn't count. Shiba said he'd heard about this pledge. But the next day, Sumura was already having a bad time as he tried to look at a girly magazine with his blinded eyes. He would surely give in and smoke. However, Sumura swore to Buddha that he wouldn't do that. Shiba pointed out that him being mad now is another worldly passion. But Sumura countered that since he wasn't acting on it, it still didn't count. Shiba was curious what he meant by this. Sumura added that since he hadn't actually seen the girly magazine, that didn't count either. Young Chihiro just watched as they argued. Chihiro recalled his father mentioning that Sumura had the fastest sword work he had ever seen. So Chihiro wondered if this was true. While the two adults continued their discussion, he used his sword and practiced. However, he couldn't completely cut through his target, which prompted Sumura to comment that he was hesitating. So he asked for Chihiro's sword to demonstrate how it should be done. Back to the present, Hishaku's men had infiltrated Senkitsuki Temple, searching for the sword bearers from the roof. One of them said to blow everything up, believing it would be impossible for anyone to hide once they leveled the place. They were startled by a jingling sound and a voice saying they wouldn't have their way. It came from two monks at the temple. The enemies recognized them as guardians of the fortress. One weren't surprised to see monks, since it was a temple. The enemy got excited, saying this would be fun. He rushed forward to attack the monks. However, when the monk chanted, the attacker's feet suddenly became trapped, his legs encased in tiles. The second monk prepared to strike him with a giant bell. The man was impressed, but there turned out to be many more attackers. The monk thought there were twice as many as reported from Kakugoku. He suspected that the attack on Kakugoku might have been just a test to gauge the fortress's defensive strength. Someone on the other side said that the three of them should be enough to defend their location. He urged his companions not to let the enemy enter. They couldn't allow them to reach the sword bearers. One monk worried that with their numbers, they could bring down the entire fortress. Additionally, with their powerful Datanseki weapons, they could easily blow up and destroy the place. The enemy had infiltrated the temple interior, running inside with the monk in pursuit. They were shocked by what they saw and wondered if this was who they were looking for. The monk became concerned when he realized Sumura himself was standing before them. He shouted, asking what Sumura was doing there. He tried to make him leave, but Sumura replied that he wouldn't let them risk their lives just for him. Back in the treatment room, Hakuri mentioned that according to Chihiro, Sumura was blind. Yet he seemed able to see, although he had mistaken Hakuri for Chihiro earlier. He was curious if Sumura fought using his sense of smell. The female sorcerer denied this, explaining that he could only use smell to detect old friends whose sense he knew. She said he couldn't pinpoint enemy locations that way. Suddenly, another sorcerer entered and reported that double the forces had arrived compared to Kakugoku. When asked about Sumura's whereabouts, his colleague said he had joined the fight. The sorcerer just scratched his head, as if he had expected this. Hikori grew worried at this reaction. He said they needed to do something, questioning how Samura could fight if he couldn't see. Uruha questioned his statement about doing something. The male sorcerer clarified that if Samura was fighting, the best thing they could do was nothing, a response that puzzled Hikori. Back at the battle, the monk was concerned about Samura's plan but left, while Hishaku's men were excited to face him. Meanwhile, the monk inside the temple fell silent before Buddha. Several men from Hishaku's group approached him. Samura apologized for defiling the sanctuary, but said he needed to get fired up. For the first time, he lit the cigarette in his mouth. The enemy was pleased to see the sword-bearer fighting alone against them. They called him considerate. Samura threw away his cigarette and split both it and the man who had spoken in half. He cut him twice, making a cross-shaped cut through his head and severing his right arm. Uruha revealed that surely, the enemy would soon enough figure out that Samura was attacking based on sound. He exhaled the smoke from his cigarette. The sorcerer added that the enemy would adapt to this. The enemies thought since he was blind and using just an ordinary sword, they could back off and attack quietly using long-distance sorcery. That's what they did. But when Samura returned his sword to its sheath and it made a sound, he managed to pinpoint one of their locations. The enemy was puzzled, wondering how Samura knew his position since he hadn't made any noise. Samura cut them down one after another with his sword, and Uruha revealed that Samura was using echolocation. While fighting, Samura would strike with his sword and return it to its sheath. Based on the reverberations, he could gauge the size and direction of enemies. This was possible due to Samura's lightning-fast Ei drawing technique. Hikori reflected on this, remembering that Uruha was also incredibly fast. Uruha replied that Samura had taught him, but he was still far from his master's level. While the intruders lay on the ground, one said his clever tricks wouldn't work. He brought out their weapon, saying they should have used pure brute force from the start. They slowly started to stand again, then charged at Samura. Meanwhile, Uruha mentioned that with Samura's skills, no one should have died at Kakugoku. As the enemies approached Samura, he called them poor chumps, saying they would go straight to hell for their wanton killing. Using his sword, he sliced through their bodies. And when Samura finished the fight, the monk facing Buddha continued his chanting. Samura became annoyed, thinking that he too would probably end up in hell. Back in the past, when Samura demonstrated to Chihiro the proper way to cut the target, he was impressed by what he did. This was the Ei White Purity style of Seiichi Samura, the contracted owner of the enchanted blade Tobamune. Looking back at the previous conversation between Chihiro and Hiyuki, Chihiro mentioned that all they knew about Hishaku was that their operations had been gradually changing over the past 4 years. There were rumors that it was a small group of elite sorcerers, but he said they weren't certain about this yet. Hiyuki added that they started making bold moves 3 years ago, when they killed Kunishige Rokuhira and the bearer of the Cloud Gouger. However, when the Kaminabi mobilized, Hishaku went quiet. She said they were doing everything they could to gather intel. Nevertheless, they still didn't have a clear picture. Unfortunately, this was why they were always one step behind. Therefore, Chihiro said they needed to break this pattern. Back in the present, Chihiro thought they needed to incapacitate Hishaku. They needed to know who they were, what their goals were, and their plans. Thus, he was determined to make Hirohiko talk to obtain more information. Chihiro prepared himself and activated Nishiki to strengthen his attacks and amplify his movement speed and agility. Hirohiko was pleased to see Chihiro eager to fight. He said he had really been looking forward to this moment. Chihiro was surprised when Hirohiko revealed they were both 18 years old. But Chihiro asked, "So what?" Hirohiko explained that killing people was an option he had learned when he was just 3 years old. He said it was engraved in his bones. However, the children around him were very different from him. Even now, he said he still couldn't find anyone his age he could call a peer. That's why he suggested that he and Chihiro Rokuhira could become friends. Chihiro couldn't believe what he said. Hirohiko was delighted to meet him, saying that now that he was 18, his hands were covered in blood just like Chihiro's. As he said this, Chihiro recalled the corpses of the Kakugoku steam squad and his father's death at the hands of Hishaku. Chihiro's eyes widened because he couldn't accept Hirohiko saying they were the same. He targeted him without hesitation, but Hirohiko quickly dodged. Hirohiko's other companions attacked as well because of this. In his rage, Chihiro told him not to equate himself with his despicable actions. However, Hirohiko repeated that they were the same, so he said Chihiro could call him Hirohiko. He clapped his hands, seemingly signaling their plan, saying it was time. Using his sorcery, he created numerous papers. These papers scattered around the area, giving him an opportunity to suddenly vanish. Chihiro wondered where he had gone, thinking that perhaps his earlier statement about their counter-int and special forces being able to kill him was just a bluff. Hirohiko went to a different location after that. While walking, he thought about how to handle his situation and noticed a nearby theater. He was delighted and decided to enter. The show was the Battle of the Sano Island, and it was about to begin shortly. Hirohiko entered the theater and watched. He thought he would let the assassins at Senkutsu Temple handle Uruha while he enjoyed himself there. The show began, and he suddenly asked the person next to him if it was their first time watching it. When he confirmed it was, Hirohiko mentioned that he had seen it before. The person told him they should be quiet. However, Hirohiko continued talking, explaining that the hero, Sasuke, would defeat the Black Ogre at the end of the story. He would get his family back, and peace would return to the island. But overall, he said, the hero was very dull, and the stage fighting was amateurish. In truth, he found it boring. His seatmate couldn't believe he had spoiled the key plot of the show. Suddenly, the person was shocked to notice his stomach and said he was bleeding. Hirohiko looked at it and said a man with an enchanted blade had managed to strike him. He then warned him to be careful too, as he closed his eyes. Back to Chihiro, he was fighting Hirohiko's companions, the counter-int and special forces, while numerous papers remained in the air. This was Hirohiko's tactic to distract and block Chihiro's view during combat. A paper butterfly was flying nearby, controlled by Hirohiko despite his absence. The Datenseki weapon was indeed incredibly powerful. Without it, he thought they wouldn't have been able to defeat the men at Kakugoku. Ideally, they could have managed if he wasn't there. However, the issue was the wielder's skill level. In simple terms, if the wielder was a total amateur and didn't know how to fight, then enhancing them wouldn't get them very far. Since they only hired random people, their skill levels were inconsistent. Obviously, they weren't coordinated like the Kaminabi. Chihiro was now on the roof while fighting the three who remained in the area. Hirohiko could see what was happening through his paper butterfly there. According to him, those three were rogue sorcerers he had personally chosen. They knew how to fight. Chihiro noticed the scattered papers and realized Hirohiko was controlling them remotely. While not lethal, they were extremely precise. These papers blocked his attacks and served as guides for Hirohiko's allies. Now, he realized that Hirohiko's earlier statement about being able to kill him wasn't a bluff after all. Hirohiko used his sorcery to create an arrow behind Chihiro, cueing a Datenseki wielder what to do, which was to jump up and strike Chihiro. While the show continued in the theater, he mentioned that the villain was coming and the good part was approaching. When the Japanese instrument sounded, the theater ceiling was suddenly damaged. This was because of Chihiro, who had managed to strike and severely hurt the three mid-air. While falling, he beheaded one and severed another's arm, then noticed Hirohiko. Chihiro landed precisely on the stage, shocking the performers when they saw him and the falling corpses. Blood even splattered on the audience where Hirohiko was sitting. According to him, the major problem with Datenseki was its short-term element. He added that Sojo took his time to understand the enchanted blade. In other words, the fact that they could only use Datenseki momentarily meant they hadn't reached mastery yet. Upon seeing Chihiro stand on the stage, Hirohiko commented that he wasn't even hurt. He thought to himself that he should have expected this from someone with 3 years of experience wielding an enchanted blade. Just then, one person's head landed upright, along with their body at the edge of the stage, and because Chihiro was covered in blood, the audience became terrified. Everyone panicked and ran away. Hirohiko thought that now that Chihiro was there, he had many weapons he could use, and those were the presence of civilians. He wondered if Chihiro could feel how, to ordinary people, he was a monster. Chihiro recalled again what happened to his father and asked who was responsible for that. However, Hirohiko suddenly shouted and asked if he still couldn't see it. He said that only he could understand Chihiro. Chihiro became fed up with his continuous insistence that they were equals, so he told him to cut the BS and prepared to fight. In a flashback to when Samura was teaching Chihiro, he was pleased that Chihiro grasped his teachings after watching him just once. Shiba remarked that he had inherited Rokuhira's eyes, which was why he learned swordsmanship from him so quickly. However, Samura commented that he was still too young. When Chihiro expressed admiration for the swordsmanship of the one he called a hero, Samura poked his eyes. This made Shiba stand up out of concern, asking why he did that. Samura replied that he sensed Chihiro staring at him in admiration, so he was just checking. He added that swinging a sword in a real battle wasn't that great. He said they wouldn't be cutting straw in battle, but people. Shiba was about to stop him, but he said Chihiro was smart. Therefore, he told Chihiro not to get starry-eyed, because they had killed many people. Back to the present, Chihiro noticed how the audience looked at him when Hirohiko said that only he could understand him and therefore they should be friends. Chihiro asked what he meant by that, and if he didn't want to kill him. Hirohiko pondered and said he wanted to kill him, but also wanted to be his friend. He thought they would become friends by killing each other. He admitted he never had a friend before, so he wasn't sure, but he thought this was right. However, Chihiro replied that what he was saying made no sense. Hirohiko clapped again, causing a storm of papers to unleash, blocking Chihiro's attack. But Chihiro said he had done nothing but run. Hirohiko responded that since Chihiro had an enchanted blade, unprotected close combat would be self-destruction. He created even more papers to completely shield himself. Chihiro became irritated because with so many papers, Hirohiko had managed to hide himself. Chihiro then noticed something moving behind him and approached it. However, it turned out to be just a terrified civilian. Hirohiko said he needed to use whatever he had. When Chihiro looked around, he noticed that people inside were being wrapped in paper to be used as hostages. He became concerned for them and searched for where Hirohiko was. Suddenly, the papers there transformed into paper cranes, which Hirohiko used to attack him. Because of this, Chihiro realized that Hirohiko could locate his position using the papers. He was just hiding and attacking with the cranes. These paper cranes were so strong that they could slice through bodies, making their direct hits lethal. Not far away, Hirohiko sat with his eyes closed, concentrating while releasing paper cranes. He asked if Chihiro was paralyzed yet. He thought that perhaps Chihiro's power to absorb didn't work on physical objects. The fact that he wasn't using it was the answer to that. If Chihiro used Kuro, he could clear the obstructing papers to see better. However, he might also hurt the innocent bystanders there. He could also use Nishiki to move faster, but the cranes chasing him might harm innocents. Therefore, Hirohiko was curious if Chihiro would just hold his ground and focus on defending himself. Since people were around, he would need to be careful with his sword. Because of this, he was doomed to die by 1,000 cuts. Thus, Hirohiko said Chihiro had no way out. But he told him not to worry, because they would show him the way. Hirohiko pushed an audience member behind Chihiro, and because of what the man witnessed, he fearfully told Chihiro to stay away. Chihiro looked at him and remembered what Hirohiko said about how, to average people, he was a monster. Hirohiko mentioned that in the interrupted play, there was a scene where the villain took hostages. Because of this, the hero Sasuke was paralyzed and the villain escaped. However, he said Sasuke was garbage. You can't worry about hostages because in real life, you'll die. He was a killer, but at the moment of truth, he wanted to be a hero, as if he wasn't a monster. Because of this, he wanted that to resonate with Chihiro. Again, he mentioned that Chihiro was one of them. So he asked who Chihiro would sacrifice. Chihiro looked at Hirohiko's paper crane, while the latter urged him to charge forward and fight to the death, just the two of them. However, because of the many civilians around, Chihiro just lowered his sword to his side, determined not to move to avoid hurting innocent people, which puzzled Hirohiko. He said Chihiro was just like Sasuke, the hero in the play. Therefore, he attacked using numerous paper cranes, slashing every side of Chihiro's body, including his face. It was evident that Chihiro was struggling because of this. He then recalled his training with Samura again. He recounted that the first time he cut someone, he couldn't bear to look at the severed flesh. That was also one of the reasons why he blinded himself. He could feel himself becoming a monster. However, that image never disappeared from his eyes. Young Chihiro asked that despite this, he chose to wield an enchanted sword to save everyone. He answered yes, and that he just had to keep flailing through the darkness. But that wasn't something Chihiro should aspire to, because he was certain he would go to hell. After hearing this, Chihiro decided that instead of admiring him, he would respect him. Samura accepted this and said that Chihiro didn't aspire to be a swordsman anyway. Chihiro agreed with that. He was about to say something else, but the scene returned to the present, where Chihiro's blood was dripping on the floor due to the numerous paper cranes that had cut him. Nevertheless, he remained standing, while surrounded by papers. Hirohiko couldn't believe what he was seeing. He wondered if Nishiki's fortification had the ability to increase his body's resistance. He couldn't accept this. Chihiro thought that his father and the sword bearers fought to protect others, which was why they could truly be called heroes. However, they avoided that label because they felt guilty for their sins. That's why they all told him the same thing, that he would find a different path from them, or that he shouldn't choose hell like they did. Chihiro apologized because now, he was also walking the same path as them. He activated Kuro, causing countless black goldfish to emerge. There were so many that they overwhelmed the paper surrounding him. As a result, Hirohiko could no longer see him with his eyes or through his paper vision. Chihiro approached him and cut off his arm and lifted his foot to his shoulder. Meanwhile, the people were freed from the surrounding papers. Chihiro pierced Hirohiko's marked hand with his blade, and when he asked what happened, Chihiro told him not to worry because he was also a sinner. The first time he killed someone, he accepted that he was a monster. Therefore, the least he could do was stop others from getting hurt and take the Hishaku bastards to hell with him. Now that Hirohiko was incapacitated, he made him talk. In the next scene, Yura was talking to someone, saying he knew the basic gist of Kaminabi's strategy. He said they were shoring up their fighting power at each fortress in anticipation of an attack, and if they were willing to incorporate a maverick like Chihiro as part of that, then they were clearly stretched thin. What he hadn't pinpointed yet was Togo Shiba's position. He said there was a whole range of skill levels in the world of sorcerers, and Shiba was at the very pinnacle, and they really struggled to get past him 3 years ago, but he would keep searching. In any case, he said, the Kaminabi still refused to divert manpower from their Tokyo headquarters, and that was probably to protect the Swordmaster, and they must be harboring him somewhere in Tokyo. He explained to his subordinate that those old goats have ironclad defenses, so they needed at least one enchanted blade to infiltrate their headquarters. It turns out he was talking to Hirohiko's companion from the train station, who said that if that was the case, their plan depended on killing a contracted sword bearer. He also asked if it was really wise to trust Hirohiko with such a crucial mission, to which Yura asked what the problem was. So this man explained that while Hirohiko had managed to chase Oruha, he then decided to confront Chihiro and leave Oruha. Yura answered the man with another question, asking if it was true that Hirohiko was still controlling the troops while sitting on a horse spring, and if so, there was no problem and in fact, it was a good opportunity, which puzzled the man. Yura explained that Hirohiko's gifts in battle were invaluable, where his sorcery could hardly be called powerful, but he had evolved it to an amazing extent, so he would master an enchanted blade quickly. However, he said he hadn't let him experience the world yet, so he was still psychologically immature. It would be good for him to interact with Chihiro a bit before getting the enchanted blades. The man reasoned that nevertheless, they had put a lot of effort into setting up their plan, so what if Hirohiko messed it up? Don't worry, Yura said, as they had many backup plans, including their trump card. They had set this up so they could afford for Hirohiko to screw up, so he shouldn't stress. For Hirohiko, screwing up, losing battles, and learning how the enemy thinks was a good learning experience. After that, we returned to Chihiro and Hirohiko's situation where Chihiro was interrogating Hirohiko to spill what he knows about the Hishaku. In Hirohiko's mind, he went back to Chihiro's Kuro move and noticed there that after accepting his onslaught using his cranes, everything suddenly turned black. Hirohiko asked Chihiro what he had done, so he explained that he detected his location by filling the air with paper, and he had done the same thing where he filled the space with goldfish and detected his position while they occupied the visual field. If Chihiro could do that, Hirohiko asked, why did he let himself get hit by the cranes? So Chihiro explained that he saw that Hirohiko didn't always make the paper into cranes, and was he right that he needed them in range to fold them, and he could only use that firepower once, and after they attacked, they died. He said he didn't use Kuro to fill the space initially, because if Hirohiko had any cranes left, he might become desperate and attack innocent bystanders. So because of that, he chose to leave himself open and let the cranes use themselves up, and that's what happened. Hirohiko asked why he would do such an extreme thing just to protect people who saw him as a monster. Chihiro answered that in the end, they weren't like them. As long as they were safe, he didn't care and it didn't matter what they thought of him. He said killing was horrible, and while it was true they were both killers, he refused to accept the ways of people like Hirohiko. Hirohiko was very puzzled by this and said he couldn't understand. Like him, he said Chihiro's sole purpose was killing and now they had met, so why couldn't he understand it? Hirohiko reasoned that nevertheless, killing was killing, so Chihiro pointed out that not all killing was the same, and he refused to accept that while thinking that if all killing was equivalent to what people like Hirohiko did, he would be betraying the belief of his heroes like his father and Samura. While Hirohiko was thinking that nevertheless they were alike and why couldn't he understand that they needed to meet and connect, he shouted at Chihiro that they were the same. So Chihiro seriously said no, and pointed out that that's the reason they seek to kill each other. Hirohiko's heart beat strongly after hearing this, and here he said in his mind that he understood it now. They were seeking to kill each other because of their difference, and that was the reason why when they meet they would have a fight to the death using everything they had. Here his thinking bore fruit that this was the beginning of their friendship, and because of that he began telling Chihiro that the Hishaku was a small group with 10 sorcerers, which made Chihiro stare at him, where he pointed out that he said to speak, so Chihiro told him to continue. He explained that their leader was a man called Yura, and he had met him at the Rakuzechi. Their current plan, which they already knew, was to attack the fortresses, and for the operation, they had hired 68 outside sorcerers, and they had 34 Datanseki weapons in their stockpile. And for this task, he said he was given total command of all their forces, including the Hishaku members. While they were talking, we returned to the conversation between Yura and another Hishaku member, and Yura commented that the Kaminabi's strengthening of security at each fortress was interesting. He was sure they had reinforced their other countermeasures, and he thought it was a smart move. But it was also a gamble because they had deployed enough firepower to match 4 fortresses, and he commented that it was really the nature of the one he was referring to place an all-or-nothing bet, which he liked. To invest like that in Senketsuji Temple clearly meant it was extremely resistant to their trump card. After that, we returned to the situation at Senketsuji Temple, where many outside sorcerers hired by Hishaku continued to charge. Inside the temple, a subordinate shouted to Samura that their enemies were surging. Suddenly roots emerged from the floor, impaling their allied forces. Before long, the room where Samura and his companions were gradually began to be destroyed by large tree roots emerging there. Returning to Chihiro and Hirohiko's conversation, Hirohiko explained that for personal reasons, he had dispatched all their forces fighting power to Senketsuji. He apologized for showing up without a proper weapon, and while saying that but now everything was ready and soon their playing field would be equal, we were shown some paper butterflies carrying 2 katanas. When that time comes, he said they both can battle to the death as equals. In the situation at Senketsuji, Hakori told his companions that the enemies were getting in and will reach them pretty soon. Uruha commented that this was bad, and they should focus on evacuating. But the female sorcerer objected and explained that Hakuri couldn't recover while they're moving. Only 10 minutes had passed since Hakuri started recovering, and he asked his male companion how the preparations were going, who answered they were almost finished. We returned to Samura, where he commented that was close. It was shown here that tree roots had surrounded the large Buddha in the room, and it turns out a Hishaku member with a messed up right eye had arrived on the scene and said whoops because it looked to him that karma would get him because he had disrespected the Buddha, to which Samura said that was okay because he would give out his punishment. In the next scene, we return to Hakuri's situation, where the female sorcerer was explaining to him that she was sure he could sense it, where spirit energy exhaustion was different from physical injuries. 30 minutes was the minimum recovery time he needed to use his sorcery without risk, and only 10 minutes had passed. Hakuri asked what risk the woman was talking about, so she explained that he could damage his brain where he wouldn't be able to use his sorcery again, or worst case, he could die. While they were talking, Hakuri's cell phone rang, and when he checked it, he saw that Chihiro had texted, saying all enemy forces were focused on Senkitsuji Temple. Because of this, Uruha and the female sorcerer said they needed to evacuate Hakuri, and she immediately ordered her assistant Fura to take Uruha and Hakuri to the emergency exit. Uruha asked what about Samura, so the female sorcerer answered that she and her male sorcerer companion would join him in battle, whether he liked it or not. Hakuri was worried about this, and when he tried to object because he remembered what the man said about how if Samura fought, the best thing they could do was nothing, Uruha shouted for him not to think about that because the situation had changed. They should leave it to those two, and explained that the Makazumi were a special force dedicated to Samura. The two sorcerers entered a room and woke up their sleeping commander. Their commander, who looked young, answered just a moment, and he still needed rest because he was a growing boy. She made him get up and said their master was in danger, and asked if he wanted him to die. Their commander took the candy cigarettes beside him and started eating them while saying he needed to get fired up for this. While this was happening, we went back to Samura's situation. Samura felt that he was surrounded here, and he was disgusted because they were swarming like maggots, so he ordered them to go down for him to exterminate them. The Hishaku member facing him said they weren't idiots, and special tactics were needed to fight a legendary warrior. The enemy sorcerer's roots began exploding and releasing smoke, and Samura noticed this. As a follow-up, one of the enemy's subordinates tried to charge at him, but he easily sliced them, which made the Hishaku member comment that even with his senses distracted, Samura still noticed hostile energy. Because of this, he thought of an idea and tried to attack Samura using his roots. Samura was slightly hurt by this, and he explained that Samura couldn't react to something with no will. The Hishaku member began making his subordinates charge simultaneously at Samura while coordinating it with root attacks. While this was happening, we returned to Hakuri, and here Uruha was explaining that they were using sonic booms against Samura. The noise they were making was surely dulling Samura's echolocation abilities, and he explained that he could detect enemies using a synthesis of acute attunement to sound, smell, and hostile energy. If they joined the fight, they would only make it worse because their familiar smells would mix with the gunpowder and smoke that would confuse Samura, and if they fought there, they would make sounds and release hostile energy, so they would also mix with the enemies. While still explaining what could happen to them, the Makazumi commander interrupted and said for them to be quiet, and they would just get themselves killed if they did that. While Samura was keeping pace, the Makazumi jumped in to aid him, and Fura explained that nevertheless, these three had special techniques. When they landed beside Samura, they didn't make any sound at all, and here Fura said they had stealth. They used ninja arts where they removed their smell, and while fighting, they nullified all their sound and hostile energy, which meant they didn't exist on Samura's battlefield. The three quickly took down several enemies here, and Fura continued explaining that without interfering with Samura's ability to detect the enemy, the Makazumi simply removed obstacles, so through these special techniques, they were the only ones who could fight alongside Samura. Samura noticed the enemies were diminishing, so he realized the Makazumi had arrived there and said if they were going to do that, they shouldn't get themselves killed. The three simultaneously helped their commander, and they showed here why they were called the Kaminabi Ninja Force Elite Samurai Bodyguards. Uruha watched this intense battle, while Fura hurried him and Hakuri to follow him. However, unexpectedly, an explosion occurred beneath Fura that destroyed their path and sent him flying. Several enemy subordinates appeared, and Hakuri's shock was visible here. While this was happening, We were also shown that Samura and his companions seemed to be struggling to match their countless enemies here, while the female sorcerer was thinking if they could handle all the enemy forces here because they were dwindling. She knew at this rate they would end up in danger. There was only one way they could deal with this, but they needed one more ally for her idea to work. Fortunately, Hakuri and Uruha arrived there, and immediately shouted that the back exit was blocked too. The Hishaku member was delighted because they were coming there like lambs to the slaughter, he said. Uruha was forced to unsheath his katana and said he needed to fight. He began charging towards Samura to help him, which worried Hakuri because the Makazumi had told them earlier they could die because of Samura if they did that, so he wondered what Uruha was doing there. The Ei White Purity style was shown to us, and Uruha and Samura's names side by side, and when these two met in battle, Uruha asked in his mind how many times Samura thought he had watched his technique. To the surprise of the Makazumi and Hakuri here, Uruha managed to dodge Samura's attack while helping him with the enemies. Amazement was visible on Hakuri's face when he saw this, while Samura cursed when he smelled that it was Uruha who had charged in there. The male Makazumi member couldn't believe that Uruha had anticipated Samura's swordplay, while the commander commented that Uruha had almost died because he joined the battle even though he knew Samura might mistake him for an enemy. Uruha told Samura not to worry and just continue what he was doing, and he would adapt to him. Samura was irritated at his cockiness, while the female sorcerer was pleased because she thought this would work. The female sorcerer signaled her teammate to help Uruha and Samura, while she began drawing a mandala on the floor, which made Hakuri ask what she was going to do. The woman explained it was a transport mandala, and it would take them to the front of Senkitsuji. While it wasn't far, she said because the fighting was concentrated in this area, it should be enough for them to escape. They needed to get him out along with the two sword bearers from this place. What about the Makazumi? Hakuri asked. So the woman said they needed to keep the enemy's attention inside the temple, so they would stay there and fight. Hakuri realized what this woman wanted to say, and the woman explained that if it was true that Hishaku had really invested all their dispensable forces in this place, that was good for them. If they could protect the sword bearers while exhausting the enemy's Datanseki weapons, that would make a big difference, and that would give time for Hakuri and the others to recover even if they sacrificed their lives because that was their job. Hakuri stared at the woman when he heard this, and thought that he was the only one like this here. He told the woman to wait a moment, which got her attention, and he started using his sorcery even though he hadn't fully recovered, while saying he was the only individual there who hadn't risked his life yet. Hakuri recalled what the female sorcerer told him about 30 minutes being the minimum recovery time for his body to avoid the risk of never being able to use sorcery again or dying. But this didn't stop him, and he still activated his sorcery. However, blood began pouring profusely from Hakuri's nose while he struggled to say that first he needed to touch Samura or Uruha and register them. The woman shouted to wait, and before she could say that if Hakuri overdid it something bad would happen, he immediately fainted from strain and exhaustion and fell at the edge of the mandala. The woman commented that it was good that it didn't work, since Hakuri wasn't the one who should be pushing himself right now because they will be needing his powers later. So for now they would handle things. Samura's expression showed that his situation wasn't easy as he kept pace with many enemies while his senses were disturbed, and the Hishaku member commented that he was really persistent, but this Hishaku member seemed to be planning something. Several enemy subordinates used their Datanseki and began rampaging like zombies whose only thought was to kill. Uruha thought about whether they had been brainwashed because they looked like zombies, and teamwork seemed pointless here against their numbers. He said this seemed to be their limit. In the woman's mind, she said only 4 people could use the transport mandala. Their enemies were becoming berserk there because of the Datanseki, and they needed to at least get the sword bearers out of this place. As for them, she explained that the Makazumi are a family of ninjas that go back centuries. In each generation, they attend their chosen master and dedicate themselves faithfully and selflessly, serving as tools to protect. In the Seitei War, they served the organization that would later become the Kaminabi. Nearly all of them sacrificed their lives in the line of duty, and their descendants continued to serve the Kaminabi after the war. They are tools to protect their masters. After that, we return to 3 years ago, where Samura had just met the Makazumi, and he commented that this was excessive, which puzzled them. The commander explained that he could object any number of times, but they were ordered to protect him, so he was their new master now. It was said here that the guardians of the fortresses were chosen to be compatible with the sword bearers. The Makazumi had no deep connection to Samura, but they were the only people who could fight alongside him, and they told him that because he didn't have his enchanted blade, he would need help. Samura then said that he didn't mind bodyguards. It's all the rest. He explained that in the past 2 weeks since he arrived, the moment his stomach growls, a meal appears. If there's a bug, the moment he recoils, it suddenly disappears. The second he wakes up, the curtains open. So he asked, was he right that they were doing all of that, and if so, they were too overprotective. The female sorcerer pointed out that their job also entails seeing to his needs, to which he said it's way too much, and the commander added not to worry and they would do anything. They were ninja, so they didn't need his empathy, and he should just think of them as tools where in an emergency, they would lay down their lives for him, which made Samura shout that that was why he was telling them to stop. He said that he knew they were skilled, but they were still just kids, to which the commander replied that he's over 20, but Samura stressed 20-somethings are still kids. He wasn't into youngsters sacrificing themselves for an old geezer like him, so if they wanted to serve him, they should stop the tools crap and not sacrifice their lives. He added that if they were going to live together at Senkitsuji, they would impose on each other. After that, we returned to the present where while the female sorcerer was drawing the mandala, Samura shouted they would shred them all apart, which fired up the other Makazumi members. Uruha asked if the female sorcerer thought Samura would let them transport him, which made the female sorcerer think that no, because he wouldn't let them die for him. However, she thought that with the number of enemies right now, she shared Uruha's thought that he wouldn't relent. The room began to be destroyed because of the roots that the Hishaku sorcerer was releasing, and his subordinates continued charging while explosions also surrounded them. Because of this, Uruha shouted that they had no time to hesitate. The female sorcerer noticed something while the Hishaku member commented that it looked like the building would collapse, so they should finish this. Samura continued keeping pace with the Hishaku's subordinates and root attacks even though his senses were weakened. It was explained here that because Samura's senses were overwhelmed by noise and smoke, the only guiding light available to him was bloodlust, which he would use to orient himself toward that glimmer. That was his only beacon in the chaos, and he would follow it. When Samura followed the bloodlust he sensed, he went to Uruha and their swords clashed, and they landed on the mandala. Samura was surprised when he smelled him, and wondered why he was doing this, to which Uruha just said to forgive him for what he was about to do. It turns out Uruha had said earlier that he knew Samura wouldn't relent, but he could guide him using his bloodlust. When he also said earlier that they had no time to hesitate, the female sorcerer had completed the mandala. The female sorcerer thanked him, while Samura shouted to wait. However, it was too late because the woman had already cast the mandala, and the female sorcerer had teleported them to the lower cliff of the temple. Samura was irritated by this and said he would go back inside, but Uruha told him that he couldn't allow that, which puzzled Samura. Uruha explained that they would take Hikori and go down the cliff. It would be dark soon, and they could escape into the darkness. That was the only victory that they can achieve in exchange for their lives. While they were talking, Hikori lay there struggling to move. Uruha asked if Samura really thought they were just throwing away their lives as tools, which made Samura fall silent. While fighting, the Makazumi spoke to Samura in their minds and said he had never let them exert themselves for him. He refused to let them sacrifice their lives for him, and that's just how he was. That was all the more reason they refused to let him die. They repeated what they said, that they were ninja and didn't need his empathy. We returned to Uruha, and he told Samura that they were desperately fighting to stop the enemies from reaching them, and unfortunately, the best way he could honor them was by surviving. Uruha remembered what his elite force companion said at the Kakugoku hot spring, that he should survive, or else they would curse him. He also pointed out here that as bearers of enchanted blades, their lives were gravely consequential. Samura thought about this for a moment, and while remembering the Makazumi's situation, Samura said for him to be quiet and he didn't need a lecture. Just as he was about to say what he needed, Hakuri suddenly grabbed his hand, making him turn to him, and even though he was vomiting blood, he used his storehouse sorcery and said what he needed, and that was Tobimune. When Hakuri released this enchanted blade, it immediately cast a crow, and black feathers began enveloping the battle inside the temple, and the enemies' necks were quickly being sliced. The Makazumi were also puzzled about what was happening because something was attacking the enemy's subordinates. They observed the black feathers falling from the air and commented that they didn't know what it was. In an instant, their enemies' bodies were being sliced one after another, which further puzzled the Makazumi. Before long, they saw who was responsible for this, and it turns out Samura had returned to the battle, but now he had the enchanted blade Tobimune. After this extraordinary attack, he shouted at the Makazumi that he was firing them from their job. In the next scene, we were briefly shown that Hakuri had managed to transport the Tobimune, while Hirohiko's paper butterflies were still carrying it along with another enchanted blade. Chihiro also continued interrogating this Hishaku member here. After that, we returned to Samura, and after he used the crow, the room was filled with dead bodies of Hishaku's subordinates, and black feathers were scattered around. Outside the room, a monk was bewildered by what he saw. The male Makazumi member also couldn't understand what had happened and couldn't believe the amount of power he witnessed, so his commander said Tobimune was responsible for that. Samura asked where the tree bastard Hishaku member who attacked them went, while we were shown that he had escaped the room using his roots, and he commented that a master wielding an enchanted blade moved so fast he couldn't even see how he moved. He used his vanishing technique again while saying this would rile up the playing field, and also wondered if he was in trouble now, and before long he vanished. We returned to Samura, who clicked his tongue in irritation at what happened, while the Makazumi commander apologized because he had to save them, to which Samura pointed out that they should thank Hakuri. Uruha arrived in the room while supporting the weakened Hakuri, and Uruha asked Hakuri if he was okay because he kept vomiting blood, while Hakuri was gasping while saying he would transport the Kamiyuri too because he thought he could do it one more time. The female sorcerer approached Hakuri and pointed out that he was hallucinating from adrenaline, and with all the blood he was losing it was clear his body was overtaxed, so he shouldn't push it anymore and needed immediate treatment. Uruha said they didn't need to hurry because according to Chihiro, the Hishaku's force was depleted. They could go to another fortress and treat Hakuri there, and soon enough they would recover all the enchanted blades from Hishaku. The Makazumi commander pointed out that they had Samura with Tobimune, and his male member pointed out that he didn't need bodyguards anymore, so Samura commented that's why he said earlier they were fired. The commander asked if he was serious, to which Samura answered absolutely because they almost got themselves killed. Samura went around to ask if the other people in the temple were okay, but unfortunately, Ryofura, a 22-year-old who was with Uruha and Hakuri earlier when they ran, had been badly hit. It was explained here to Samura that this man came to the fortress to work 3 years ago, and this was his first assignment as a guard. Sadness was visible in Uruha and the Makazumi commander's eyes when they saw him lying on the floor, and Uruha asked the female sorcerer if Fura had a family, so the woman explained that he had a sister who was 8 years younger than him. She said staying at Senkitsuji Temple was free, so he gave his salary to his sister. Samura remembered what Uruha told him about them being bearers of enchanted blades, their lives being gravely consequential, and rage was visible on Samura's face while remembering this. The female sorcerer commented that Fura didn't die in vain, and explained that they fought valiantly to protect the contracted sword bearers, and this was a major turning point. Samura disagreed with what she said and pointed out that unfortunately, this was just the beginning. We moved to Chihiro's interrogation of Hirohiko, and Hirohiko suddenly said here that they failed because they had gotten the Tobimune, which caught Chihiro's attention and made him think it was because of Hakuri. In Hirohiko's mind, he said this event only changed their path, but the destination remained the same. After that, he told Chihiro that they would kill the sword master and Yura would wield the Shinuchi. Chihiro commented that they don't have a lot of options, and they wouldn't let any contracted bearer die, To which Hirohiko pointed out that's right and they needed to protect those heroes. He said this was exactly why Yura called him green, and Chihiro remembered their conversation with Yura about that. Hirohiko asked if he had heard about school, and explained that it was a cozy place where neither of them would fit in. He also asked if he knew what was taught inside it, and said they taught that the sword master and all contracted sword bearers were heroes like Kunishige Rokuhira. He said the sword master led other sword bearers in protecting people using the great power of enchanted blades, and their wonderful achievements led to peace in Japan. Chihiro commented in his mind that this was right, and that's what he was taught too. However, he immediately contradicted his thought and said no. And when it came to the Shinichi, his father would always suddenly become clammed up, as well as about the sword master. He said everything he learned about the Shinichi only came from books. After that, Hirohiko asked if it was right that Chihiro only had surface knowledge, to which Chihiro didn't answer, and Hirohiko took back his question and pointed out that Chihiro knew everything. He asked if he was right that he witnessed the power of the Shinichi at the Rakuzechi, which made Chihiro ask where Hirohiko's questions were leading. Chihiro also thought here that honestly, when he first saw the tip of the Shinichi's power, he was overcome with doubts. He questioned the saying about it being powers of heroes who saved their country, and wondered if it was really a power meant to save people if it was that brutal. He said he thought the reason why the sword master was hidden under ironclad security was because, according to his father, they couldn't let anyone use the Shinichi again, and his father's reason for saying that was the Shinichi's power was too horrible and needed to be contained. But when Kyura held it, he felt a different person in his body. He asked himself what if it wasn't the Shinichi that was out of control, but the sword master himself, and what his father was hiding was more crucial than he thought. While recalling what Hirohiko told him, Chihiro asked if he meant to say the sword master wasn't a hero who should be protected. He suddenly felt a headache and pointed out that it had been non-stop today, where his mind was extremely confused by the events. Hirohiko answered his question saying that at least that's what Samura thought, and that was why they made a pact with Yura 3 years ago, while he continued telling himself this couldn't be, and whatever the truth about the sword master, if the Shinichi was released and the Hishaku could use it, they would destroy their country, which made Chihiro think about how to stop this. Hirohiko repeated what he said earlier that they couldn't let any of the contracted sword bearers die, and pointed out that Chihiro kept saying that repeatedly. He said their plan had already begun, so he understood why he was fired up. Hirohiko then asked if Chihiro knew what Samura said about how the contracted sword bearers should die, which started to shock Chihiro and made him ask if Samura really said that, while remembering what he said about just needing to continue flailing through the darkness. Chihiro found it hard to believe what he heard here, where Hirohiko told him not to think about it too much, and while the paper butterflies were dropping the other enchanted blade, Hirohiko added that they just needed to fight until one of them died. Hirohiko waited for the sword to fall and waited for the right timing, and before long it fell on the stage. Hirohiko moved immediately when he saw this, where he swept Chihiro's foot and bit his severed hand to throw it at him. Suddenly, several shards flew in from outside through the window, forcing Chihiro to dodge and move away from Hirohiko while thinking enemy reinforcements had arrived. Unfortunately, because of this, Hirohiko managed to get close to the Kamayuri, and using his mouth he unsheathed the enchanted blade right in front of Chihiro. Hirohiko's paper butterflies slowly unfolded here while 2 geisha spirits also emerged. When he saw the spirits, Chihiro remembered Uruha, which painted his face with inexplicable confusion, and some blobs similar to Hakuri's power also began to appear. Chihiro couldn't believe when he saw the Kamayuri here, and while this was happening, we moved to a flashback 7 minutes ago. At Senkitsuji Eastern Gate, Samura was walking with his other companions from earlier, and here while the male Makazumi member was carrying Hakuri, Uruha asked if he was okay. The female sorcerer pointed out that she had given him first aid because they couldn't fully treat him right now, so the best thing to do was for him to rest first. She said his powers were essential to Kamunabi, but for his own sake too, he should know that pushing himself too hard was dangerous. However, the female sorcerer said thank you, and their commander added that if it weren't for him, they might never have seen Samura again. After that, The woman explained that they could rest now because even if it took them a while to heal Hikori's wounds, or worst case he didn't recover, the enemy forces were depleted, and they had Samura with Tobimune on their side, so they didn't need to hurry. Before long, Hikori fell asleep while being carried by the male sorcerer, and some time passed. Next, all of Hikori's companions suddenly collapsed while walking, and when he woke up to this, he was worried by what he saw. When he turned to look in front of him, he saw Uruha gasping while asking the still-standing Samura what this was for, where it seemed Tobimune had been used because of the flying black feathers. Hikori noticed there was no blood scattered around, so he thought perhaps their companions were just unconscious. He just watched the conversation between the two sword-bearers, where Uruha asked again if Samura was losing his mind, to which Samura said he was perfectly sane and pointed out that since he arrived here they hadn't had a proper chance to talk. Samura began to ask him, if they went ahead with the plan and recover all the enchanted blades, would that really solve anything? Which made Uruha stare at him with a puzzled expression. If it was that simple, he said, Rokuhiro wouldn't have needed to set aside the enchanted blades after the war, which also puzzled Hikori. Samura pointed out that he hadn't held the enchanted blade Tobimune for 18 years, and if he were to hold it again in the name of Kunishige Rokuhira, he needed to root out evil and protect the weak. Uruha agreed with what he said and explained that was why he needed the sword to fight the Hishaku. He said they killed Kunishige, so they were evil, to which Samura agreed. But there was an even filthier evil than the Hishaku that needed to be punished, even if they needed to collude with Hishaku. Both Uruha and Hikori were puzzled by what they heard, and here Samura clarified that he was talking about them, the sword-bearers. 18 years ago, he said, they covered up an incident in a particular place, which further puzzled Hikori about what he was referring to, and Samura continued his explanation where he said they buried their crimes, and Kunishige and their companions were recognized as heroes which they accepted if that was what was needed to restore society. And after that, he said the youngsters who thought they were heroes died to protect them from Hishaku. They would continue to stake their lives for their heroes. He mentioned that those youngsters' deaths versus the sword-bearers' just deserts isn't something that needs to be weighed. So Samura swore that all 5 sword-bearers, including himself, would all die by his hands. This got Hikori's attention, while Uruha was still confused. Samura added that unlike the Hishaku, using Tobimune, he could take down the sword-bearers and let their protectors live. Uruha objected and said if he killed him, Hishaku would be able to use the Kamiyuri, so he also asked if this was what Samura wanted, and emphasized again that they were the ones who killed Kunishige. Samura explained that he would just let them use it briefly to kill the swordmaster, but after that he would kill them all, as he wouldn't let the Hishaku do harm with the enchanted blades, and in fact it was a convenient way to smoke out the blades. He also said here that his intention was to cut the root of evil. Uruha thought about whether Hishaku could overpower Samura using an enchanted blade where he thought the chance was too small, but he also remembered what Samura said about not letting the Hishaku destroy the enchanted blades, which he believed. Samura added to him that they would settle everything connected to the enchanted blade. They wouldn't involve the youngsters in all of this, and only the evildoers like them would die. Uruha answered that he understood where Samura was coming from, but while remembering his elite bodyguards at Kakugoko Hot Spring, he reasoned that nevertheless they died for him, so he couldn't just throw his life away. The roots that the Hishaku member had wrapped around when they were still fighting gradually disappeared, causing the collapse of the building it had enveloped, while Hikori struggled desperately to call out to Uruha to talk. He blamed himself that Uruha would die because he wrongly transported the Tobimune, while the room where they fought earlier completely collapsed. Samura took 2 katanas and threw one to Uruha while saying their egos were the only things moving there, and the only thing left for them to do was a battle to the death. The 2 walked toward the edge of the rooftop barrier, and each took their stance in preparation to charge. Because of this, Hikori tried to use his sorcery to call Chihiro, but it didn't work. With the speed of the 2 sword-wielders' attacks, they seemed to vanish from where they stood, and suddenly we were shown again the Ei White Purity style. Samura unsheathed his katana, where after a few moments they clashed together, causing a large slash on Uruha's left shoulder. Hakuri watched the events intensely, while Uruha fell to his knees from his wound. Hakuri began blaming himself because he hadn't pushed himself enough to transport the Kamayuri, but he suddenly realized he can still do something. After their clash, Samura put the katana he used aside and took the Tobimu Ne. He immediately unsheathed it and stabbed it into Uruha's body, while Uruha weakly asked him if he would really carry all of this. Samura said yes, and added that nobody else has to endure this hell other than himself. Hakuri continued forcing himself to teleport something, while Samura finally sliced Uruha's body upward. While this was happening, the blob from Hakuri's sorcery began to form, and Chihiro gradually emerged from it. Unfortunately, a horrific scene greeted Chihiro when he returned to his friends, and he only saw Uruha bloodied on the ground while Samura was returning his katana to its sheath. Samura noticed his presence and pointed out that Chihiro was drenched in the stench of blood, while Chihiro still couldn't believe what he was seeing. Chihiro's expression was indescribable as he stared at Uruha's lifeless body, and he asked why. Samura pointed out that Hakuri was okay, which confused Chihiro, so he added that he wasn't dead. Chihiro struggled to understand what was happening and asked if Samura was responsible for what he's seeing here. He remembered Hirohiko's words about how the sword master isn't a hero who should be protected, and that the sword bearers should die. Chihiro's world was shaken when he realized something, and he remembered the time when the Hishaku predicted his and Uruha's drop-off, leading to them killing the elite guards at Kakugoku Hot Spring, and the time when they attacked their house. Chihiro shouted that the Hishaku had killed his father, and he also remembered what Samura had told him when he was a child to call Kunishige a hero. He couldn't control his emotions anymore and pressed Samura about what possible reason he had for bringing the Hishaku to the enchanted blades. Samura just fell silent at this and observed the surroundings. Then he suddenly uttered the word revenge. He then mentioned that he had heard the rumors about the 7th enchanted blade and realized it was what Chihiro was holding. He pointed out that he would take care of the others, so Chihiro should put down the Enten. However, Chihiro refused and angrily said that if Samura was an enemy, he needed to kill him. Samura felt Chihiro's killing intent here, and Chihiro began charging while shouting that he would really do it. Unfortunately, before Chihiro could get close to Samura, he used a swift strike on him similar to what he used on Uruha, and it hit solidly on Chihiro's right shoulder. After that, he commented that Chihiro didn't need to do anything anymore, while Chihiro immediately collapsed and dropped his Enten due to the attack he sustained. While picking up the blade, Samura said this was the problem, and Chihiro could do nothing but watch. Suddenly, Chihiro's bloody body and the Enten vanished in front of Samura, which surprised him, and it turns out Shiba had arrived at the scene and immediately teleported Chihiro to a nearby rooftop. Shiba's concern for Chihiro was evident when he found him in this situation, while Samura commented that Shiba took long enough. Shiba also saw that Uruha was no longer alive, so he realized that perhaps the contract for Kamayuri was now open. He asked Samura why he was doing this, so Samura said that the Hishaku knew about their sins, which shocked Shiba. While showing us the sword master, he added that they intend to tear off the lid and bring their country down. He then said that as long as they continue to live as heroes, the curse will forever bind them. He also noticed that it seemed Shiba hadn't told Chihiro about what he was referring to, and commented that he's better off not knowing. After that, while Chihiro was dying in Shiba's arms, Samura said this was the end, and he used Tobimunea's power to become a clump of bird feathers and vanish from the scene, while Shiba tried to wake up the unconscious Chihiro. After 2 hours, it was confirmed that the two contracted sword-bearers, Yoji Uruha and Chihiro Rokuhira, were dead. In the next scene, we moved to a room, and here were Hirohiko, Yura, and another Hishaku member who had his mouth hidden behind his wide collar, and he was treating Hirohiko's severed arm using an intricate medical sorcery. Hirohiko told them that Chihiro suddenly vanished right in front of him when they were fighting, and he was disappointed because their fight was apparently getting good. Because of this, his teammate questioned what he said and pointed out that both his arms were cut off in the fight, So he told Hirohiko that he's lucky that Chihiro got sent to Senkitsuji. Hirohiko disagreed and said that if they thought about the situation there where he already had the Kamayuri, the fight was indeed getting good. So his teammate agreed with what he said. However, he mentioned, he also noted that Chihiro was really strong in many aspects. He then asked Yura why he wouldn't let him wield the Kamayuri and said he wanted to at least try it. So Yura explained that it was just in case because someone was coming. One of their members wondered and asked if he had told that individual where they were, so Yura pointed out that he hadn't, but they were now facing the enchanted blade bearer who controlled the Seitei War. Suddenly, someone cast a skill called Owl, where the sky darkened and was covered with owl eyes. Black feathers also started raining around the area, and inside their room, Yura added that their freedom would be curbed for a while. Soon after, the black feathers entered their room and Samura arrived here, causing Hirohiko and the others to turn towards him. Upon arrival, he immediately asked what kind of plan they had made there, and pointed out that those people didn't need to die. Yura answered his question and said that the ends justify the means. They had liberated the enchanted blades and exhausted Hakuri's strength because they would have difficulty if he was in good condition. When Samura was about to say that if they had given him Tobamune from the start, Yura cut him off and explained that he was the trump card they wanted to keep aside because he was a risky move for them, where even some of them were resistant to involving an outsider. If that's the case, Samura said, then it was up to them, but they should make good on his promise. And here we were shown what appeared to be a tattoo on Samura and Yura's pinky fingers that seemed to symbolize their promise. Of course, Yura said, as long as he kills the remaining contracted sword bearers, the pinky promise they made remains unbreakable. While the two were talking, another Hishaku member explained that immediately after Kunishige was killed, Yura went straight to Samura's house and made a contract. They discussed that Samura would kill the contracted sword bearers under the conditions that all identities of the 10 Hishaku members would be revealed to him. The identity of the Kaminabi insider who leaked Kunishige's location would be shown to him, and the locations of the enchanted blades would be revealed. After that, Yura commented that Samura really went all out because he even killed Chihiro, which caught the attention of Hirohiko and the member who's treating him. Samura explained that he did it because Chihiro would have interfered with them and there was nothing else he could do. Yura commented that the deep sins of the contracted bearers needed to be punished and Samura's conviction seemed solid, to which Samura said of course. While they were talking, Hirohiko suddenly shouted in irritation because he was shocked that Samura had killed Chihiro. He began to grow sad and tearful while saying that they were supposed to fight until death, and that he had finally made a friend. He angrily told Samura that he will kill him to avenge his friend Chihiro. Samura responded that he didn't know why he was freaking out, but Hirohiko shouldn't worry while calling him Little Pipsqueak, now contracted to Kamayuri. Because of this, they were surprised how Samura knew that, and Hirohiko wondered if he smells like Kamayuri. After that, Samura said that to fulfill the contract, after they killed the sword bearers, he would fight them all to the death. Another member commented that that was the risky part of their contract. With Samura's help, killing the contracted sword bearers had become easier, but their problem was what would happen after that, the information he would get from their agreement. He added that as far as Samura was concerned, the purpose of this contract for him was to get information about all the sword bearers and every person connected to the Hishaku to kill them all. In other words, Samura was a threat to the Hishaku. Samura commented that he understood that they had sealed up the Kamayuri and isolated the blade, adding that it was a good idea. Another member also thought that the only reason Samura hadn't killed Hirohiko yet was that if another person became contracted to Kamayuri again, this would never end. Samura said that when a blade was unsealed, he could detect it wherever it was placed, which meant he could watch Hirohiko, so he shouldn't get any ideas. Hirohiko just stared at him there, while his teammate thought that even if Hirohiko was healed up here and using Kamayuri, he thought he still wouldn't stand a chance against Samura. Samura added that he would kill all the sword bearers alone, as long as Yura and the others provided him with information. Samura explained that the Kaminabi seemed to have changed their defense because they saw that all fortresses were empty, so they thought that perhaps Shiba was involved in those changes, and they needed a week to get a good idea of their barriers and how their forces were positioned, to which Samura said to just let him know, and he vanished. After that, the high-collared member asked if they could handle Samura and pointed out that it wasn't a good idea to play a trump card right away. Yura responded that they couldn't do anything about it, and if it was too reckless, he wouldn't have played it. On the other hand, he said it was time to act seriously and focus on succeeding with the plan. Next, we moved to Samura's travel, and he was thinking that in just 1 week, everything would be over. We were then shown Chihiro's body lying on an operating table along with several doctors. While showing this, Samura added that Chihiro didn't need to become like them. In the operating room, Chihiro's body seemed lifeless while he was being operated on, but to everyone's surprise, his eyes opened despite his grave injuries. After that, we shifted to the Kaminabi headquarters on November 10th at 3:14 a.m., where they discussed everything Hakuri had heard from the conversation between Uruha and Samura, including the Hishaku's plan to kill the contracted sword-bearers. The leader, who harbored anger towards Chihiro, commented that Samura was the last person they needed to defect from their group, while another showed empathy towards Uruha. The leader with glasses mentioned that now their enemies could use both Tobimune and Kamiyuri, but before he could elaborate on their plan, he was interrupted by the long-necked leader who inquired about Hakuri's condition. Azumi explained that while his body was physically capable of communication, the neural pathways governing his sorcery were damaged. He was currently undergoing intensive treatment, though there was no guarantee of complete recovery, and as he explained this, we were shown Hakuri lying in a high-tech machine resembling an MRI to monitor his brain activity. The white-haired leader clicked his tongue in irritation, saying they had little hope left, while the masked leader pointed out that Hakuri had done much for them, and they needed to recognize that their grasp of the situation had been naive. The leader with 2 circles on his left eyebrow then asked if Shinichi was all they had left and inquired about the progress of its sealing, to which someone responded that the process was steady and about 3/5 complete. One of the leaders mentioned that now that they couldn't rely on Hakuri to transport the swords, they might need to consider using Shinichi, prompting the white-haired leader to advise against hasty decisions and suggest they observe the sky first. He pointed out that the owl was still cast there, and according to reports from all their branches, it surrounded the whole of Japan. He added that with such a vast reach, it could probably only detect truly massive levels of spirit energy, so in other words, it was an enchanted blade detector. Samura stated that he wouldn't allow Hishaku to use the enchanted blades carelessly, and he believed they could trust him on this. After that, he also asked if the other leaders had effectively hidden the 2 remaining contracted sword-bearers, to which the masked leader responded affirmatively, saying they had hidden the restaurant along with Subaru, which prompted the leader with eyebrow piercings to comment that it was a good idea since they couldn't contain that old coot unless they let him make sushi. The leader with glasses commented that now that they had isolated the 2 sword-bearers, the information warfare would be gridlocked for several days. They would let Samura and the Hishaku wear each other out in the interim, as they didn't need to charge in with Shinichi and interfere with them. The risk was too high, so it would be better to keep that as a last resort. Their best move would be to shore up their defenses and ambush them. In the next scene, we move to the bedridden Chihiro, whose eyes seemed to have lost all hope. Shiba entered his room and checked on him. He said he knew that there's no making sense of it and asked about his injuries, to which Chihiro only responded that Uruha was dead. He recalled what Uruha had said when they first met on how he sees his father Kunishige in him. He pointed out that he was murdered while remembering the horrific scene he had witnessed. Samura was the enemy, and he had stabbed him, which nearly resulted in his death. However, Shiba said that wasn't correct, and that he had actually died, his heart had stopped, and his death was confirmed. Nevertheless, a few minutes after his death, the gash in his lungs and liver had healed, and the wound had closed. Though he had lost a considerable amount of blood, his body was almost totally restored aside from that, leading Shiba to think this was either an insane miracle or there was another reason. Chihiro then mentioned that his eternal contract was now broken, and that's when he gradually realized he had truly died. After that, he asked where the Enten was, but Shiba didn't answer him, which puzzled him. Shiba began explaining that he believed Samura had deliberately planned his revival, which prompted Chihiro to ask how he had done it, to which Shiba replied that it might be part of Tobimune's power, though he couldn't be certain. This puzzled Chihiro, and he asked that even if he could revive him, why would he kill him temporarily? So Shiba explained that one reason might be to warn him and send a message that he couldn't protect Chihiro, and another possible reason was to sever his eternal contract with Enten and prevent his quest for vengeance. If that was the case, Chihiro said, it seemed Shiba had received his warning loud and clear, to which Shiba agreed and said it appeared so. Shiba recalled how he apologized for being late when Kunishige died, and told Chihiro that he had failed to protect him a second time. Chihiro tried to reason that nevertheless, they had no evidence regarding Samura's plan, but Shiba quickly interrupted him and pointed out that Samura had no reason to kill him. This silenced Chihiro, but shortly after he asked why then did he need to kill Uruha. He recalled what Samura had said about the sins of the sword-bearers and the things Shiba hadn't told him, and he tried to ask Shiba about these matters. But before Shiba could speak, the door to his room suddenly opened. It turned out to be the commander of the Masumi, who said it was nice meeting him as Samura had told them about him. Chihiro thought about why a child was visiting him due to the commander's appearance, and this was when the commander introduced himself as the head of the Masumi ninja clan, who had been Samura's guards for 3 years. He told him not to worry because even they were totally baffled, and they had been knocked out before they could react, and they had also been dismissed as his bodyguards. After that, the commander asked him if he had heard about his friend, so he thought he was referring to Hakuri, and he answered that they said he was fine. The commander pointed out that upon waking, he had started blaming himself for Uruha's death, which brought deep sadness to Chihiro's eyes. He had requested them to watch over him, and as he remembered telling Hakuri that he needed his help again, he also felt concern for him. In any case, the commander said it was their duty to watch over him, but recently, they had allowed their personal feelings to be involved. He pointed out that Hakuri had saved their lives, so until he's back on his feet, they wanted to do everything they could to resolve their problem. Chihiro looked down and asked if Uruha was really killed. So Shiba explained that since he had regained consciousness, he had the same thought, so he contacted the morgue. He learned there that he had been sent to forensics for an autopsy, where he also pointed out that normally they don't release any information without authorization, but he was trying to negotiate for an exception. But given that they hadn't heard anything about anything yet, perhaps it would be better for Chihiro not to hope, to which Chihiro shook his head and said he refused to believe it. He said he had no way to understand the events and why they were happening, and he also said there were too many things he really couldn't accept. The commander said he understood that and how aggravating it was, and even they were totally left out in the cold with no idea what Samura was really thinking. He showed his disappointment in how he treated them like children, which made Chihiro stare at him. When Shiba was about to speak to Chihiro, he told him that he couldn't give up now because it was too much for him. He said there were people whose lives he had taken, so he couldn't stop now. While remembering Kunishige as the enchanted blades were being shown to him, he pointed out that his father had taught him that even little by little, you need to learn things by watching them with your own eyes. He earnestly requested Shiba to tell him what had happened, adding that whatever the truth was, he needed to understand Samura's reasons, since he was going to hell anyway. The commander commented that he was glad they were in agreement, and after that, he told Chihiro to rest for a few days because afterward, they had a special assignment for him, and that's when they'll go have a talk with Samura. This made Shiba turn to him, and while standing, he told Chihiro that he thinks Samura went easy on him the first time, since the Enten was left to him by his father, but explained that the next time Samura kills him, he will surely keep the Enten. He also asked if he was ready for that while apologizing to Kunishige and Samura in his mind. He thought that if he were a real adult, he would have stopped Chihiro by force to prevent his rage of vengeance from ever growing. After thinking for a moment, Shiba suddenly handed the Enten to Chihiro, which left him speechless as he realized Shiba had been carrying it all along. Chihiro told Shiba with a serious expression that he wouldn't die again, to which Shiba responded that he would believe him. In the next scene, we return to the Kaminabi headquarters where the leaders were still in discussion. The long-bearded leader stated that in terms of fighting power, Samura was a greater threat than the Hishaku, and therefore they should assemble a force to contend with Samura. When he asked if they had enough fighters for that, the leader with eyebrow piercings answered that there was one person who came back to life, and there were more additions to that. Next, we were shown numerous ninja arts weapons, and here someone was explaining that the coat of the person he was talking to was torn up, so he gave him new clothes. The person put it on while it was being explained that this was the official uniform of the Masumi, a ninja attire. While this was happening, we returned to the leaders' meeting, and the long-bearded leader explained the capabilities of a specific group, that with their ability to conceal every sound and scent, they were the only force capable of fighting alongside Samura, and by the same token, they were the only ones with the potential to become Samura's greatest nemesis. After that, we moved to an elevator in a certain location, and as it opened, Chihiro was gradually shown to us. When the elevator fully opened, it turned out he had joined the Masumi and had new attire, and this seemed to be the group the long-bearded leader was referring to that would face off against the blind swordsman Samura.